In the last 24 hours, we have had 2 rounds of drone strikes in Yemen. The first one launched yesterday by the United States in retaliation for strikes on commercial shipping, drone, and anti-ship missile attacks in the Red Sea. Let's show you some footage of that, and then we're going to talk about the background here. So this is footage of American aircraft launching from the USS Eisenhower, which is, I think, our most up-to-date, top-notch aircraft carrier. They had this thing in ports for like 2 years, just fixing the reloading systems. This is the most up-to-date aircraft carrier. It engaged in, one second, I got it all listed here. It engaged in a bunch of strikes. It engaged in 27, no, that's not the right one. Let me read the other one. So the United States and British warplanes fired attacked 27 Houthi locations associated with 27 drone and missile attacks that targeted commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. But if you guys have been paying attention, this is not a new development that have just fallen out of the sky. Like randomly, the United States has started bombing Yemen. And for a lot of people, they're finding about the war in Yemen for the first time, or they're finding out about Yemen's involvement specifically with the Israel-Hamas war for the first time. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a background on the Houthis, a little bit of background in the Yemeni Civil War, and then how they got involved with the Israel-Hamas war and how that has spilled over into the Red Sea, and then eventually with American airstrikes and British airstrikes in Yemen and Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen. So who are the Houthis? Well, the Houthis, to put it simply, to not get into all of the complicated political history, are a Zaidi Shiite Muslim group, a militant and political movement that's deeply associated with, and this shouldn't be surprising from the name, the Houthi tribe, which it got its name from. It has been like gaining momentum since the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, gaining more steam until eventually coming to the surface and having a lot of influence during the 2011 Yemeni protest movement during the Arab Spring, which eventually culminated in a transfer of power as people were upset about how the government in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a was ruling the country and dictating terms and how people live their everyday life. And so just like many other countries in the region, they went through the Arab Spring. There was a transfer of power, but the Houthis were not satisfied with any of the reforms implemented. And to be quite frank, the government that did transfer wasn't exactly reformative, was not exactly a reformative justice movement. Not necessarily saying that the Houthis are asking for a reformative, secular, fantastic state, but for whatever reason, complicated as it is, they eventually said, we're not working with this government anymore. We're skedaddling. We're done with this nonsense. We're rebelling. And they rebelled and ended up taking off over large swaths of the country. I think we have a map here that shows what's controlled by the officially recognized government of Yemen and what's controlled by the Houthis. The Houthis are in green. They control the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. They also control everything north of the Gulf of Al-Deb, not Al-Deb. I forget the name of the Gulf here, but I forget, it's called like the Unfortunate Entrance. I forget the exact name for it. But this choke point, they control everything north of it. This crisis, this commercial shipping crisis, would be worse if they did control the Gulf here, because it would be much easier for them to target commercial shipping. But they control the green. The official government of Yemen, which is internationally recognized and backed by the Saudis, is in red. And the yellow is the Southern Transitional Council, which as of 2022 has aligned itself with the government in red. And they're working together. They've done some like power sharing agreement on some council. It's complicated, doesn't really matter. But if you're interested in why there is a Southern Transitional Council, it's because they believe in secessionism. They believe that there should be a separate Southern Yemen, as there was during much of the Cold War. There used to be a dividing line in Yemen between a North and South Yemen. You can look at it into yourself, but obviously complicated civil war. Oh, and that little white area is Al-Qaeda. There is Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So this is the civil war. It's been raging on since 2014. The Saudis got involved rather quickly to prop up the internationally recognized government. They've attempted to bomb the Houthi political movement into submission with not much success. Also, for those of you who are seeing these signs everywhere of the Houthi movement, this is like, it's kind of like their slogans. For those of you who are interested in what it stands for, since this is everywhere, it's basically like their coat of arms. The top line stands for God is the greatest. The second line below it stands for death to America. Then the third one is death to Israel. Fourth, a curse upon the Jews. And the fifth, victory to Islam. To give you an idea of their religious-based ideology. They've also been accused of all sorts of human rights abuses, torture, executions. You get the idea. I don't want to get into all the humanitarian stuff. That is a segment for another day. But point is, though, the Saudis failed to bring down the Houthis despite a brutal bombing campaign that killed tons and tons and tons and tons of civilians, and a blockade that starved the population, leading to many hospitals to shut down and cut services and have much difficulty helping people who had been hurt by the shrapnel or were dealing with a malnutrition, which was a massive issue in Yemen as they dealt with mass starvation. But eventually, around 2022, the Saudis figured out that they're probably not going to push the Houthis into the sea, and they're not going to bomb them into submission. So they started doing ceasefire negotiations. And a ceasefire has generally stayed in place since then. There's been violations here, violations there. But since 2022, and there's basically been a ceasefire or something resembling a ceasefire as they try to negotiate a post-Civil War future. Who knows if it will stand? There's a decent chance that the Saudis will pull out of Yemen, and then the Houthis will just attack the internationally recognized government anyway. Who knows exactly how it will go, but there's a ceasefire standing. So there's the general background of the Yemeni Civil War. So how does this impact the war between Israel and Hamas, which would be, for all intents and purposes, a totally separate conflict? Well, first off, Iran is the main backer of the Houthis. The Houthis get about $100 million, if you believe U.S. State Department officials, $100 million in weapons every year from the Iranians. And when you look at these anti-ship missiles that are being fired at commercial vessels, when you look at a lot of the equipment that's being used, reasonably speaking, it would not be easy for these guys in a country that has been leveled by 8 years of bombardment to produce these things on the scale that they're using them. I mean, it's not impossible. They certainly have some domestic weapons production, but we have good reason to believe that a significant amount of their weapons every year comes from the Saudis. And many people consider them, and with good reason, to be somewhat of a Saudi proxy. Not a Saudi proxy, an Iranian proxy. They don't get the weapons for the Iranians, they get their weapons for the Iranians. An Iranian proxy. And so many are saying that this is an effort by the Iranians to use the Houthis to pressure the Israelis. This is the same reason, by the way, that the Saudis were so nervous about the Houthis, is because the Saudis, have a geopolitical conflict with the Iranians, and they don't want the Iranians to be able to use Yemen in order to just launch rockets and drone attacks and up pressure upon Israel from their south. Which, by the way, the Houthis have launched drone attacks on Saudi ship oil production, which has hurt it significantly. So one angle as to why they're getting involved is because the Iranians back the Houthis, they give them the weapons, they have a geopolitical reason to try to align with their main backers' interest in wanting to fight the Israelis. So there's the Iranian angle behind it. There's an ideological angle behind it as well, as many people throughout the region hate the Israelis for what they're doing in Gaza. And while many governments are in a state of atrophy, unable to respond because A, they don't want to deal with Israeli bombing, or B, they really don't feel like they can do that much or have other motivations not to do much, like the Saudis, for example, were pursuing normalization with the Israelis before the war between Israel and Gaza after October 7th. Whereas the Houthis, they're willing to take that risk for the benefit of either becoming popular in the region or, and this is definitely a part of it, popular at home, because supporting Palestine is extremely popular amongst the vast majority of the populations throughout the Middle East, throughout the region. So I do think that there's domestic political reasons to support it. There is an ideological reason. They don't like Israel. Curse upon the Jews. I think there's an ideological reason there to try to fight the Israelis. And of course, they are also a proxy of the Iranians, and the Iranians fight the Israelis. So there's multiple reasons for them to want to fight the Israelis. And now that they have a ceasefire, they could feel more maneuverability than they did before. For example, the strike that happened on the Houthis is not the first time that we've striked Yemen. We've striked Yemen a few times to bomb Al-Qaeda affiliates in the area, and we've even had a few strikes that have gone pretty disastrously in Yemen, killing a lot of civilians. But the last time we struck the Houthis specifically, that was back in 2016 after they did a drone and attack on ships in the Red Sea. On American ships. We then bombed them, and they hadn't attacked us or attacked our shipping or attacked our ships until, well, this month. So it had, at least from the American government perspective, at least worked for 8 or 9 years to dissuade the Houthis from attacking again. But that's their ideological motivation. That's their domestic political motivation. So they want to get involved in the war. Originally, and most people forget this, the Houthis just started firing rockets at Israel. Now, this didn't really work because Israel's got a gigantic dome protecting it. And the Houthis, as much as they're getting from, Iran, they don't have the most high-tech rocket systems in the world. And they probably don't want to fire rockets this far away, only they probably get shot down in 99.9% of cases, spending the majority of their arsenal basically as target practice for IDF interceptors. Now, that could still, of course, bear a cost on the Israelis. Those interceptors are expensive, but they weren't satisfied with that. They weren't satisfied with becoming target practice for the IDF. So they looked elsewhere to see where else maybe they could take advantage of a vulnerability that the Israelis have in order to strike Israel. And so the Houthis, not having much traditional military capability, people have been joking a lot about their one F5 trainer pilot, trainer plane. They looked around, and let's look at a world map quick. They looked around. They're here, they're looking around, and they're like, man, we can't really strike over to Israel. What do we do to fight the Israelis since we don't have a ton of traditional military capability? But what we do have is drones and missiles. And so and this is something we're going to have to be vigilant about in the future, after the war in Ukraine, I think people have to be really concerned about the vulnerability of international shipping lanes. The war in Ukraine, through their drone Sea Baby program, which has been used to blow up, I think that in coordination with other means, has been able to destroy 20% of the Russian Black Sea fleet in just the last 4 months. They've taken out tons of transport ships and even have targeted in 1 or 2 instances, I think, ships taking goods to Russian ports. Now, these ships in this program, these Sea Baby ships, these tiny drone ships, were started up and expanded the production of in a very short period of time, 1 to 2 years. And we've seen the Ukrainians quickly design drones that can travel 500 miles. And that's what the Ukrainians were able to do in a year, maybe 2 years, with Western partners and internal ingenuity. Now, this technology is only going to spread with time. There's a lot of conflicts where you're starting to see these grenade drop drones and other type of drone technology implement more and more and more. But I want to throw you guys a scary scenario. So let's say you get these 500 mile long drones that are relatively cheap, and you give a lot of them to a militant group near Singapore, where I forget the exact amount of world trade that travels through this area, but last time I checked, it's somewhere between 30 and 40% of world trade travels through this area. And so let's say you've got a militant group in this area using these drones to start targeting ships. And you blow up a ship here, blow up a ship there. Now, the thing is about being a terror group or a militant group that wants to have a political impact and not a pirate, which is what we're more familiar with in Somalia, is it's a lot easier to just blow up a ship than capture a ship. All you got to do is hit it. And if you've got a 500 mile range drone in a choke point like this for international trade, or say up here or near Panama or near the near this part of Africa, the Red Cape. If you get one of these militant troops, a ton of those drones to target commercial shipping, you can have a real impact on international trade. And so they thought, well, maybe what we could do, and this is what they announced, is target Israeli ships headed to Israel, and this is their publicly stated position, and target the Israeli ships, stop them, board them, capture them, and stop any ships that are headed to Israelis' ports. Problem is, though, in comparison to just causing tons of chaos and, you know, bringing up insurance rates, which a general attack on the Red Sea could accomplish, just targeting the Israeli ships is much more difficult, because the vast majority of ships that travels through the Red Sea are not Israeli. They're not Israeli owned, they're not Israeli operated, they don't have Israeli crews, and they're not headed to Israeli ports. In fact, the Red Sea sees about 10 to 15% of world trade travel through it. I believe a significant amount of oil production and world oil supply also travels through the Red Sea. But the problem is, the Yemeni Houthi rebels don't probably have all the technical equipment to specifically only target that. And if they only targeted that ship, all the Israelis have to do is just go around the Gulf, and other ships could just continue through the Red Sea. It wasn't going to have necessarily a gigantic impact to just go after the Israeli ships alone. So it seems like what they have done, instead of just going after the Israeli ships, is just started blind firing at everything in the Red Sea. Just if there's a ship in the Red Sea, they fire at it. And there have been many instances where ships have been targeted that are not associated to Israel. And the ships that are associated with Israel that have been targeted, a lot of that association is very tenuous. It's not, oh, this is operated by the Israelis or this is owned by the Israelis. It's associated with a firm that has an Israeli on the board, or it's associated with a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows an Israeli. There are a few ships that it's less tenuous, but the vast majority of these ships here really have no relation to the state of Israel or the war between Israel and Hamas whatsoever. Let's just go through a few of this. This is one, for example, that does have some sort of connection. But again, the connection is somewhat tenuous. It's owned by Galaxy Maritime Ltd, which does have an Israeli businessman tied to it. This was hijacked by the Houthis and was brought to a port. But if you look at other ships, like, for example, the Chem Pluto is actually a great example. This is an example of a ship that was headed from Saudi Arabia to India and was carrying crude oil, but was hit off of India's coast. Thankfully, its coast, which was mostly Indians, again, not Israelis, ended up being safe. But when you look at all the people affected here by the Chem Pluto being blown up, it's really hard to find the Israelis really tied to it, or to see how much they're actually affected. The MV Chem Pluto is Japanese built, owned, and insured. It's operated by the Netherlands. It's Liberian flagged, and its crew is Indian and Vietnamese. So there are a lot of people who could be interested in this boat getting blown up. Not just, you know, regional powers, but other people like India, other people like, for example, anyone who insures ships like Greece or Liberia, or, for example, the Egyptians, who have their budget heavily reliant on the Suez Canal and has now seen traffic through the Suez Canal decrease by about 60%, which is going to have a real impact on the Egyptian economy, which is already going through a period of malaise. So a lot of these ships don't really have much tie to Israel. Their crews don't have much tie to Israel, but their lives are still being endangered. And while no one has died yet, thankfully, when we're talking about the Chem Pluto, that was hit. That ship was hit, and it was transporting crude oil. Now imagine that it was hit at a different angle, and they actually ended up igniting that energy resource. That could have killed a lot of people. And so this is a risk, and to be quite blunt, is not having that much of an impact on Israel. While Israel, of course, is not having its ships go through this area, and they're trying to divert most of their ships around Africa, this is also affecting tons and tons of other unrelated parties, and has been ineffective in blockading Israel like the Houthis have intended. The Israelis just went around, and everybody else just had to go around. So it didn't have really much of an effect on blockading Israel. It's going to have an added cost when it comes to transportation. The real effect it ended up having on the world, outside of making these ships have to travel more and go around the African coast. And when I say they have to go around the African coast, that sounds slightly annoying, but it's more annoying than you think. It's not just, hey, we got this shipment a little late, that sucks. It also comes with increased transportation costs. It also means that you're going to be, like if a ship is delayed by 11 days, right, or delayed by a significant period of time, it's ultimately going to be like you just have one less ship transporting along the route. If it takes a ship 11 days instead of 6 days to transport goods to a location, then it's basically like you cut down 50% of your transportation capacity. That's not to mention, the increased costs for ships that are going to have to spend more money to port at ports that are overburdened, with many ports in southern Africa now being burdened by being diverted. And the big thing that's going to be a risk to any of these transport companies or anyone worried about inflation is a gigantic increase in insurance costs for commercial shipping. Through this area, traditionally or recently, the rate was 0.07% insurance. That means for the goods on your ship, that's how much you have to pay to insure them. The last I heard, the rate is now 0.5. And while that doesn't sound like a lot, I tell you, it absolutely is. And so if you're transporting something like very expensive, machine goods, cars, something like that, that can become even more and more significant, motivating you to either A, go around and then go through all the delays I talked about, which not only hurts the ship because they have to pay more costs and it takes longer for them to transport around, but it also hurts if we're talking about inputs and industrial goods like metals and coals and stuff like that. It also hurts other people who are involved in nation's domestic economy and the production sector. For example, it might a oil ship that is diverted and has to spend now another week going around the coast of Africa. That doesn't just affect the increase in shipping. That doesn't just mean that you're getting less oil overall because you could have transported maybe twice the amount of oil in the same amount of time. But on top of that, it means that if anybody's producing or engaged in industry that requires that input, they have to put everything basically on hold while paying people salaries, while paying to keep everything operational and to maintain everything while they're not producing. And those costs are then passed down not only to the shipping companies, but then to production, which then goes on to the consumer and then has inflationary impacts, which going into an election year, and the only reason I mention this is because we're going the election year is because I'm sure this is something that is on the Biden administration's mind as well, could have a devastating impact on not only the American economy, but other regional economies as well. Especially the Egyptians. The out of everybody, I think the Egyptians probably have the most at stake. So this being of concern to the international community, the UN Security Council came together and passed a resolution. And let me tell you something, it's very hard to get all the members of the UN Security Council to agree on everything or even to abstain on something like this. But they came together and called on the Houthis to stop firing on ships traveling through the Red Sea. They did not respect that, though. And then after 2 months of strikes in the Red Sea, and the largest strike happening on Wednesday with 21 targets, which was 19 drones and 2 missiles being fired at the Red Sea, both American and British vessels then engaged those drones and missiles, shot them down, but determined that they were a risk to American ships. And so the Biden administration, seeing 2 months of bombardment and 2 months of warning from the Biden administration and the UN Security Council saying that they had to stop, decided that they had to strike. Now, why did the Biden administration decide that they had to strike? What was the motivation? Well, I think there's a few motivations here. The first motivation is stopping the Houthis from striking in the Red Sea. Now, I don't necessarily know if it's going to, but the motivation in the purest sense is that if they show that there is a penalty for striking ships, commercial vessels in the Red Sea, then maybe that could stop the Houthis from continuing to do so, as our strikes in 2016 stopped the Houthis from regularly targeting American ships. Now, this is broadly associated with deterring the Houthis, the concept of deterrence, and we're going to talk about deterrence more in a second. But when it comes to this and whether this is going to be effective, I don't know. It's really hard to say. The Houthis have been bombarded for 8 years by the Saudis and have been able to make it through it. They're probably this area of the world is probably one of the most bombed places on the planet right now. I don't think it's that far out to say that 26 locations being bombed by the American government might not be enough to dissuade them if the domestic political benefits or the resources given to them by the Iranians outweigh the negative effects. Now, of course, this can change as the escalation ladder goes up if this continues to escalate, which, considering we just had another strike, is not impossible. As we can see, U.S. launches another retaliatory airstrike against the Houthis in Yemen. But I don't think it's far-fetched for me to say that it is far from guaranteed that the Houthis, which have been bombed endlessly, in many instances by American-produced bombs as well, for the last 8 years, are now going to just turn around because of one strike from the United States. So the idea that this strike is going to stop it is definitely up in the air. And I also should put forward that they did end up launching another missile today, but mistakenly almost hit a tanker carrying Russian oil. And I guess this kind of shows, once again, the problem with the attempted Houthi blockade. It is, again, blind firing based on either insufficient data or just an attempt to garner attention. Almost base, damn it. No. Even if they ended up blowing the Russian tanker and they said, oh, it was for Ukraine or whatever, they try to be as base as possible. The increase in insurance costs would take away any baseness from it, and in the long run would not have that much of an impact. But the Houthis engage in another cruise missile strike afterwards. Now, to be clear, they missed. It was one, but they did engage in another cruise missile attack on a ship. They missed. Didn't hit anything. So I'm already seeing people, and I think they have some reason to say that this is evidence that it's not going to deter the Houthis from doing it again. Now, maybe it'll deter them from doing it on such a wide scale. Maybe it will deter them from specifically shooting anywhere near American ships if they can avoid it. But this is not necessarily going to stop strikes on shipping, and they could slowly re-escalate back. Or, and this is the risk, they could escalate it even more and try to fire even more missiles and more strikes and more drones in response, which would then lead to an escalation crisis. And considering how America is engaged in the world right now, and that we're again in an election year where the Americans very much do not want another war in the Middle East, that is something that's causing great concern. But we need to talk about another concept of deterrence. If the American government or any government was to allow, and this is something that is almost certainly being considered, was to allow any militant group or any group period to openly target commercial shipping along a major choke point with no repercussions, will that not encourage behavior down the line by other militant groups to say, in order to achieve geopolitical goals, just target international supply lines and then cause more security crises down the line? Maybe the strike is meant to indicate that if you target commercial shipping, you will be attacked, you'll be blown up, and it's to act as a deterrent, maybe not necessarily even to the Houthis, but to potential other groups, like some secessionist movements that might want to target shipping in order to garner attention for their movement. Mr. Gamamoto, thank you so much for the 100 bits. Doesn't Russia use different insurance companies for ships now after the war? I believe so. I don't know all the specifics about Russian insurance companies, but there have been there's been a lot of scuffling about there. Thank you for the 100 bits. I appreciate it. So there's two elements to the deterrence: deterring the Houthis and deterring others. So when we're talking about deterring the Houthis, I think the odds of this succeeding, honestly, are pretty minimal. And in order to make it succeed, they might have to escalate to a level that could end up, instead of deterring them from doing further strikes, escalating into a crisis. So there is real risk here, but putting that to one side and looking at the other element of deterrence, deterring other powers and other militant groups from doing this in the future. Obviously, I can't look into the future, but that I am much more open-ended on. I am much more open-ended on that. So I do want to add one more piece of information that I thought was interesting, and I don't see it being covered much in Western press. And it's the only source I've been able to find for it so far is Sky News Arabia. So do take it through a grain of salt, but I don't believe Sky News would just completely fabricate this. But Sky News Arabia is reporting that before we did the strikes, and I've seen none of the Western press covering this really, before we did the strikes, the big one, not the last one, we actually informed the Houthis that we were going to be doing the strike in order to de-escalate the attack. As in, we are bombing Yemen, so in a way we're escalating in response to their escalation. We are saying that we will not allow that go unchallenged. But Biden wanting to, balance this escalation, because if they accidentally blown up some like high level Houthi command, what if they ended up like killing the Soleimani of the Houthis by accident, when all they wanted to do was make sure that there was a cost for targeting commercial shipping? So they did inform them before the strikes. It still led to the death of 5 Houthi fighters and the injuring of 3 others, but none of them, as far as we know, were civilians, which is, I guess, at the very least, good. If we're going to be doing strikes, you don't want civilians to be dying. So what do I take from all of this? What do I take from all of this? Man, there's a lot. Now, before we get into the response to this and what I think of the response, here's what I think. Here's my take. First off, the Houthis are not being that effective in fighting Israel. They tried to attack Israel directly, that failed, so they looked for something vulnerable, and what they saw was a international trade choke point. They said that they were going to just be targeting Israeli ships. They said that they were just going to be targeting ships headed to Israel or that are owned by Israeli companies, Israeli commercial shipping, and they've ended up attacking almost everything but commercial Israeli shipping or ships headed to Israel. They've attacked ships headed to totally different locations. They've attacked ships that have been flagged with Greece, Liberia, Saudi ships, Indian ships. They have attacked crews from all over the world and hijacked ships and took a crews hostage that were not headed to Israel and that were not Israeli owned and operated. So the idea that this is simply a blockade of Israel, I gotta say, it's a very messy blockade. If during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we just started randomly hijacking like Guatemalan ships and firing upon like French vessels, at some point you would have to say, I don't think that's a blockade. I think that's not allowed. And I don't think that's at all legal. Because I've seen people, one second, and we'll get into the response in a second. I've seen a few people like this. Yemen is one of the only countries right now meaningfully acting to protect international law and human rights. It is not legal to blind fire at commercial vessels through international waters. That is not fighting for international law and human rights, especially when said blockade isn't working, isn't effective, and is honestly hurting other people more than it's hurting Israel. So I don't think that they're standing up for international humanitarian law through this. I don't think it's, quite frankly, achieving any of its intention according to what the Houthis are putting out. So the first thing I want to say is that when it comes to like, is this like a brave standing up for the Palestinian people? This has no impact on the war in Gaza. And they are starting to fire, and not starting, have straight up fired at tons of people unrelated, putting ship staff and others at risk. Tons and tons of sailors at risk. Not to mention starting an inflationary crisis and gaining the ire of the UN Security Council. So, first things first, the Houthis should not be doing what they're doing. If they wanted to if they were literally just going out and hijacking boats headed to Israeli ports, honestly, I probably wouldn't even be doing a segment about this. But that's not what they're doing. And so that is the segment we're doing. Or if we were doing a segment, it'd be a lot shorter. So that's the first thing. The Houthis shouldn't be doing that. Second thing, when it comes to the legality of this strike, which is being debated, there are two elements that are being debated. I've seen Ro Khanna and a bunch of others say that the strike isn't legal. One second, where is it? Yeah, here are a bunch of people that have come out condemning it. Many of them for reasons of it's unconstitutional and illegal. These people include Representative Omar Tlaib Bush, Holly Bowman Lee, another Lee from Pennsylvania, Barbara Lee from California, Presley, Pocan Jayapal Khanna, and Republicans Mace, Taylor Greene, Gates, Massey, and Senator Lee and Rand Paul. So they're opposing it. Many of them, or at least like half or more than half of them, are opposing it because they believe that it is unconstitutional for the president to act this way and engage in a war. And that's the way it's being phrased, a war with the Houthis without congressional approval. While when we talk about the Soleimani strike, the element of not informing Congress is not the thing at fault here, because Biden did inform Congress within 48 hours as stipulated in the War Powers Act. He did do that, but he did not ask for congressional approval. And so what they're saying is that the United States does not have the authority to do that without congressional approval. Now, there is two exceptions. Well, there's like 5 or 6 exceptions, but 2 exceptions here that are related that I'm going to talk about that the Biden administration would use in court if this was challenged to try to defend their actions. The first is not the War Powers Act, but Article 2. And Article 2 of the Constitution states that the president is the commander-in-chief, and that the president, while he does have to get constitutional authority to declare war, he does not have to get congressional authority to declare war. He does not need congressional authority in order to defend the United States or defend American troops. Defend. That's the idea. If America is attacked, he doesn't need congressional authority to defend. And then there's the 1973 War Powers Act, which states that the president, within engaging in hostilities, they have to inform Congress within 48 hours before doing, what Biden did, and that they must get congressional approval to go to war or deploy troops longer than 60 days. This was put in place after the secret wars in Laos and Cambodia terrified Congress into thinking, wow, there's so much happening overseas without our authority, even though it's our power to check the president. Let's put this in place. But in the War Powers Act, one of the exceptions they give for congressional authority is if the United States is attacked and it's defensive. So what the Biden administration, and I've seen other like Western think tanks, like people from the Brookings Institute have said, is this is legal because it's covered by Article 2 and it's covered by the War Powers Act defense. Our ships, according to Biden, were fired upon by the Houthis, 21 projectiles, 19 drones, 2 cruise missiles. They were fired down and then responded to after 2 months of warnings and Security Council condemnation. And therefore, after being attacked one too many times, with this attack being larger than ever, the American government decided to respond and attack those who had attacked them, attack their supply nodes and their ammunition, which they use to attack ships, to attack commercial vessels with drones. Therefore, it's defensive because we're firing at who's firing at us. That will be the Biden administration's argument. Now, I think that we need to pass legislation to clarify the War Powers Act and to clarify Article 2. And to try to make, you could even try to make the rules more stringent. But if someone's asking me, this is put in front of court, will this be ruled in favor of Joseph R. Biden as constitutional? Right now, probably. Now that's separate than whether that should be the case or whether that you believe it's the correct constitutional argument, that's how it would probably go. I believe that this needs to be clarified with new legislation, and I believe Congress has to be a check on presidential power. But as of right now, in the legal landscape that we have, I think it'd be very difficult to win this court case. At least for this one, since American ships were fired upon. So that's the second thing I wanted to throw out there. That's my second big point I wanted to make. Lastly, as for deterrence or whether this strike should have been done, I believe at the end of the day that firing upon commercial vessels like the Houthis did blindly is inevitably going to end up with the result we had, either from us or someone else, if it continued to escalate. I think that telling them in advance to try to manage that escalation, try to manage that strike, to make sure we didn't kill anybody, like super duper important. But enabling deterrence, I do think it was out of all the ways to do it, that was probably one of the better ways to do it. As for whether or not this is going to effectively deter the Houthis from doing this again in the future, if you had to put a gun to my head, I'd probably say no. But it's not only about probably deterring the Houthis, but other actors as well. Personally, putting aside whether or not the Houthis, kind of quote unquote were asking for it by just blind firing on commercial vessels and pissing off everyone in the region, including multiple people on at least everyone on the Security Council to allow this to go forward. The Houthis have really fucked themselves here. And I think that they kind of made their bed and they're sleeping in it. And the best case scenario, though, considering that, still is ending the war in Gaza as soon as possible, so this conflict could be avoided in the first place. One way to end this, knowing that it won't lead to further escalation, knowing that it wouldn't spiral out into us being involved in a regional war, and ending the threat to civilian shipping, would be finding, as soon as possible, a rapid conclusion to the fighting in Gaza. That would be one of the best surefire ways to guarantee this stuff doesn't happen again, so there isn't any risk of escalation, and we don't even need to talk about deterrence. And if people wanted to look at American policy towards targeting of shipping in the future, they could say, hey, we bombed them there, we engage in deterrence. In the future, people look at shipping and attacks on shipping, they're going to think, hey, those Houthis attacked shipping, what happened? They got bombed. So I think going forward, we've got that message out there, finding a solution to the war in Gaza is still going to be the safest bet to end the fighting.